I laid my palm on her knee because my fingers felt like they might fly away from me otherwise, because the room spun like a fevered coin, and because when Seraphine Valois smiled at me the way a sword smiles before it bites, everything I had been taught to hide fell out of me like coins from a pocket. "You can choose any woman you want, human," she said, the amusement in her voice like cold glass. The words should have been a test of obedience. Instead, they tore something open inside my chest, and before I could fashion the right answer, the one that would bind me to safety and silence, I said, under my breath and with all the terrible honesty I had trained out of my face, "I want you." Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. The moon outside the chamber window was a full, unblushing coin, and its light slid across Seraphine's cheekbones and silver hair like a river of mercury. Her private rooms smelled of jasmine and smoke. The tapestries showed wolves taller than men stalking through forests made of beaten gold. The Crescent Court's heart was a palace in an older city folded into itself so often it had become secret. I had learned to move through its corridors like an apology. As the Coven Registry's archivist, I brought paper to law, transcribed bargains into neat, legible scripts, and baptized old sins with dates. It was a life of margins, of reading other people's danger and keeping my own face blank. "You know why I asked it, Mara," Seraphine said, without heat. Her voice was always flat enough to hold storms. I heard the court behind her, quiet like a waiting beast. The alphas and braves gathered beyond the heavy doors, listening for scandal or softness. Her silver crown, threads of frost and small sapphires, sat like a question on her brow. She could have taken my life that night with a look. She could have turned the room into rumor and the rumor into law. Instead, she smiled like someone indulging an insect. My right hand tightened on her knee. The gesture was the most treacherous thing I'd done since the funeral, and it felt like proof that whatever steel built me had rusted in the rain. "It's not a loyalty test." I lied, because that was easier than telling the truth. In that moment, the ledger my mother left me burned like an ember behind my ribs. Half-charred sheaves of paper, ink that bled midnight curses. Her final note had been a scrawl, "Never be chosen, not ever." And then her handwriting dissolved into ash smudges and a door that smelled of rosemary. The locket she left, its small dented heart, hung from my throat like a second pulse. I had carried those relics like contraband. To be chosen by a monarch of wolves felt like someone reading the ledger aloud. "How many times have I said it?" Seraphine pressed, though her voice had softened in the smallest way possible. "You may name anyone from the human wards, any woman the law allows, an ally for the bloodline, a name on the ledger that will—" She used the old word, the one that made the air feel like rope. "Choose for the court, archivist." I wanted to choose someone safe, a widow with little inheritance, a scholar with no clan, a woman who would bow her head and make the right kind of children and decline, politely, the crown's whispered requests. I had rote lists of acceptable names, women who would serve the pact without asking for rights or redress. The right answer would tuck me back into the registry's margins, and the ledger's ash would not quiver. I had taught myself the correct pronouns of consent and fealty. I kept the registry's quill warm between my fingers, as if writing would prove my humanity. But when I looked at Seraphine, when I looked at her mouth that had issued commands that rewove borders and laid entire covens to sleep, I saw how lonely she was under her silver flakes. I saw the way her shoulders held storms she could not name, the exhaustion in the tilt of her chin. The court expected a name. My truth pushed a hand into the law and snapped it shut. "I want you," I heard myself say. The room inhaled like a bellows. For a beat, thin, precious, the queen's amusement curdled into something else. Her pupils narrowed, not the animal slit that betrayed appetite, but the human curiosity that had been beaten flat by centuries of rule. The braves behind the door shifted. Someone braced their palm against the oak, as if to steady themselves against the scandal. In a place where deals were currency and bodies were promises, saying "I want you" was both heresy and peril. "Bold," Seraphine said, and her lips lifted in that unreadable smile. "Dangerous." Her fingers were cool against the back of my hand. There was a reason the Lycans preferred dangers curbed into rituals. They were easier to control than the quick, stupid things humans called love. "And you are certain?" Once named, the pact carries weight. The court will expect heirs and obedience. The wolves will need assurances. The vampires will smell anything amiss. There are deaths. "There are deaths," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Beneath my words, my mother's ledger glowed like a grave. The last name in it, my ancestor's signature, a spidery line of ink, was a covenant signed in panic, promising protection in exchange for submission. My brother had nearly been taken by that bargain the winter the moon grew teeth, and he hadn't known how to stand. He had come home with savaged hands, and a silence like a bruise. The ledger confessed that our bloodline had been bartered, half wrangled into the court's favor, and half thrown away. I had spent my life cleaning other people's marks. I had hoped to keep my own messy and private. Seraphine's expression softened in a way that belonged to the blessed few who had ever received honest requests. "If it is me you ask," she said, "understand that I am not a comfort. I will offer you protection according to law. You will be tethered and witness to a survival older than either of us. I will ask for loyalty. You will be expected to produce an heir or to willingly swear other bonds. Are you prepared for the sacrifices required of the one who binds the crown to the human line?" Her question was a net. The court's laws were teeth. The crown took, with etiquette and appetite. I had read the clauses in countless hand-copied volumes. The human who binds the queen shall cede certain freedoms in exchange for the queen's shield. I knew the terms, not well enough perhaps, but well enough to know the scale of what I was proposing. The ledger's ash that sat behind my ribs flared. My mother had been right to warn, and wrong to never explain why she had run. "I am tired of hiding my family's history from the registry," I said finally. My voice carried more than the floor could hold. "If the court requires heirs, I will discuss terms, but I will not be traded like an offering. I will not be chosen as a commodity. If you ask for my name to seal a pact, then it must be with my consent." Her eyes searched my face like a judge examining a flame, and for the first time I felt the presence of something like mutual appraisal. Not predator and prey, but two creatures measuring what they might give and what they might lose. "Consent," she repeated, tasting the word. A human notion, often naive among pacts. Her fingers tightened, and I felt, absurdly, the pressure as if she were anchoring me. "And what of your magic, Mara Ellis? The registry keeps paper, but cannot keep blood secrets forever. Your mother left a ledger and a locket. She also left something the court disfavors. If you carry witch blood, if your line can alter the old covenants, then—" Then the room shifted. The queen's hand moved, unconsciously, to the locket at my throat, and I had to pull back like someone seeing a blade near an exposed vein. "Don't," I said. It was not only a plea. It was a memory. My mother's hands, the small foxed ledger, the way she'd traced a line and warned me without finishing the sentence. Seraphine's face smoothed. "I will not pry what you hide, archivist." There was an oath in her voice, old as wolves, seasoned like iron. "But if you are to bind the crown to a human line, secrets become a liability. If witch blood runs beneath your skin, it must be known and named. The court does not negotiate unknown threats." I thought of the night my brother had bled and the moon had laughed. I thought of the ledger's half-burned pages, the ink like roots. There were terrible truths in my family. Practices of old women who spoke to winter, rituals for scaring away wolves, charms that had once been traded for protection and then used as shackles. To bring Seraphine into that history with nothing but the thinnest promise of consent would be willful blindness. Yet to reveal everything would be to tear open our last privacy. "Help me," I said, surprise and humility braided tight. "Help me lift whatever the ledger did to my blood. Teach me what the pact demands, and, in return," my throat closed, "I bind my name to yours, if we make the covenant together." The Queen's smile was small and almost private. "That is an arrangement," she said. "We will speak to the council. We will consider security for your kin. But understand, the court will watch you. Victor Ash will certainly watch you." Her voice darkened like thundercloud. Victor, a name that slid through the court like a shadow. An ancient vampire whose debts to the Queen were ledgered in lives and favors. He had reasons that were not always the court's reasons, and he had ways of rewiring loyalties with a raised eyebrow and a well-placed scandal. "Victor?" I repeated, because the thought of the vampire's eyes on me made my skin feel like tax paper. He had smiled at me once in the registry, an offer thin and predatory, and I had filed his visiting slip into the "Do Not Admit Alone" drawer. His presence in our coming negotiations would turn careful plans into knives. Seraphine's gaze went distant. "He will resent any deviation from precedent. He benefits from the court's shaken orders. He may ally with those who prefer you anonymous and afraid. Choose your witness," she said finally, "and choose quickly. The moon does not wait." I left her chamber with the locket heavy against my sternum and the sound of the court's murmurs like tidewater in my ears. Outside, the city slept with 1,000 clandestine breaths. In the registry, moth-eaten tomes and brittle contracts smelled of dust and the faint ghost of my mother's handwriting. I had asked for a queen. I had asked for the impossible. And I had, more dangerously than any oath I'd transcribed, offered myself. Downstairs, in the muted light of the archive, I opened the ledger and touched the burned edges like a wound. The ink was stubborn. My mother had written as if speaking to a future she suspected would be cruel. There were names crossed out, shorthand for bargains I didn't understand, and in the margin, written in the small, hurried scrawl of someone who had run out of time, were the words, "If chosen, remember the moon eats what you hide." I realized then, with a clench of terror and the smallest thrilling quickness of hope, that to be chosen might mean more than the court's binding. It might mean a chance to rewrite the ledger, to teach a queen what consent looked like inside a palace, to force a crown to learn a human's word. If Seraphine accepted my offer, everything in me, what I was taught to guard about our blood, what I had never learned to ask for, would be exposed to moonlight and claim. And I, Mara Ellis, archivist, daughter of a ledger, trembling human with witch blood I half believed was a story, felt the world tilt under the weight of one small, lunatic truth. I wanted to be chosen not out of fear, but because the person who could take me was the one I wanted beside me when the moon came to gnaw. The thought was both sacrilege and salvation. I folded my skirts around me in the empty registry and readied myself to tell the court my answer. The ledger crackled in my hands, and beyond the thick stone of the palace, the moon listened. The registry's lamps guttered low as dawn bled at the edges of the city, and I sat with the ledger like a conspirator forgiving itself. I had arranged danger into a neat sentence, and that made it feel almost reasonable. I told myself the court's laws were ink, not fate. I told myself consent could be a binding too. And as the sun stole the moon's secrets away, I began to catalog what exactly I had asked for and what I had given. The first obstacle arrived as a summons written in a hand as sharp as a fang. It was from Victor Ashe himself, dispatched by Raven and stamped with a seal that meant he expected obedience even from paper. The message was polite and concise. It was also an invitation to tea. To refuse was rude. To accept was a risk. I took the note to Seraphine. She read it like a woman who had swallowed an ice cube and kept her face still. "Hell be a thorn," she said lightly, but the machine of her jaw moved with something like calculation. Victor tests every deviation. He prefers the court predictable. You, Mara, are not something he will applaud. "I don't want his applause," I said. My own voice surprised me with how small it sounded in the Queen's sitting room. The lamps threw our shadows long and familiar across the rug, and for a crooked moment she looked less like royalty and more like a woman listening hard to the world. "I want him to understand that I'm not a ledger item." Understanding from Victor usually comes in the shape of leverage. She steepled her fingers. "I'll arrange that you are not alone at any meeting. Choose a witness from the human wards or one of my trusted braves. Whomever you name will be recognized by law." My mind supplied faces as easily as if I were turning pages, women I could pick who would stand stoic and silent at my side. But none of them felt like defense. None of them bent toward the dangerous sweetness I had felt in Seraphine's smile. Saying her name again would be merciful and foolish, protective and reckless. "Choose Seraphine," Victor said when he arrived, not as an offer but as a fact folded into velvet and venom. He took tea like a courtesy and wielded charm like currency. His eyes, when they landed on me, catalogued me with the same hunger some men reserve for trophies. A human chosen by the Queen. It stabilizes the court's optics. It placates the old houses. He spoke of optics. He spoke of the court as a machine. When he asked me whether I understood the sacrifices required, it felt less like interrogation and more like an appraisal. I told him the truth. About the ledger, about my mother, about the bitten winter that had marked my brother. And Victor listened like a collector weighing the worth of a coin. "You have witch blood," he observed quietly. "That explains much." He smiled then, his teeth an elegant inventory. "Power is a curious thing. You keep it in the dark, and it will only eat at your edges. Bring it into the light, and it becomes transaction." Seraphine interrupted with the authority of history. "This is no negotiation between us and you, Victor." Her hand rested lightly on the back of the chair, as if to remind him of old debts. "There will be no predatory alliances. The archivist will choose on her terms." Victor's glance slid from Seraphine to me like oil. "Terms are expensive," he said, and the way he spoke the word suggested he had a ledger of his own where people were tallied by favors and favors owed. And bargains do not like change. If the Queen diverts from precedent, she invites instability. Instability feeds those who prefer the dark. The meeting ended without blood, but with an aftertaste like metal. Victor left a card stuck between the registry's bindings, the symbol on it a warning: "I will be watching." The words sat like a bruise. After he left, Seraphine took my hands in both of hers. It was the first true intimacy we had been allowed, public, sanctioned, and still heavy with the weight of what the palace demanded. "The court will be noisy," she said simply, "but I intend to move the noise into manageable channels. I will set the council's hearing for next week. Until then, you will not be alone." "I know how to be alone," I said, and my mouth tasted like an apology. I was lied to as much by the things I told myself as by the court's machinations. "I am not asking for protection because I'm weak, Seraphine. I'm asking because my family was bartered," she completed, and I blushed with the relief of being read. "Your mother feared for you. I respect that fear. But you must also understand. If you bind your line to the crown, enemies will call it power to be eaten. Victor will not rest. He will seek ways to make the court uncomfortable. He will probe. He will attempt to destabilize what he cannot control." Her words were practical, but there was a tremor beneath them that I recognized like an ache behind the teeth. "And you?" I asked. "What do you lose if you take me? What becomes different for you, Seraphine?" For a moment, the queen's regal armor slipped. "I lose an option I always assumed belonged to me," she said. "I lose the right to act without accountable reason." She smiled in a small, bitter way. "I might gain the right to want, openly, a thing I have kept hidden because I could take it. The court will hunt that admission." The vulnerability of it unsettled me in a way that was both feral and holy. I started and then shut my mouth. Words about wanting and needing had a map that led to violence in our world. Desire was flirtation and hazard in the same breath. But Seraphine, still holding my hands, closed the distance that formality had kept between us and kissed the inside of my wrist as if burying an apology there. "You are not a ledger," she whispered. "You are a woman with a history, with a family, with fear. The court rarely remembers the last of those. I will." After that, the days were a blur of rules and rituals. The council demanded hearings. The clerks required evidence of my consent. Victor's shadow lengthened at every gathering, appearing at walls and corners like a stain. I learned the liturgies of the pack as if they were rites to protect me. Oaths, blood-binding demonstrations done on waxed plates, the ritual naming of witnesses. I sat through them with my fingers clenched until my knuckles hurt and told myself that this performance would become reality because we said the words aloud. But the world is less obedient to words than we pretend. My body remembered something else. On the night the council convened, the moon was a blade across the city, and the chamber smelled like iron and worship. Bravers wore their anger like ceremonial fur. The elders, who had seen moons enough to map their edges, watched me as if I were a new problem to be solved. When I rose to speak, to state my agreement and lay claim to my consent, the words fluttered inside me like moths. I opened my mouth, and instead of the prepared phrases, an ache leaked out, the thrum of the old blood inside me, a memory of a chant my grandmother used at baptisms and funerals, the sound of a woman's voice calling the moon by name. The sound did something unpredictable in the chamber. It tasted like a spell. The air turned viscous, like honey. A breeze folded through the torches, though the windows were shut. People flinched. Seraphine looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face. Shock, yes, but also a raw, green awe. Victor's jaw set. "What did you say?" he demanded later, after the council had adjourned in uneasy silence. He stood closer than the law required. He spoke softly, as if images that can erase a life should be shared in whispers. "You have magic, Mara. That is no ledger entry. That is a weapon." It has always been there, I said, astonished at my own breathless candor. I kept it on the sidelines because my mother told me to. I kept it in ink and ash, but it is in me. Seraphine moved to my side and took my posture like a shield. If witch blood is present, she told the court, loud and composed, her voice the blade it needed to be, then we will integrate it. The crown recognizes the risks and the potential of the archivist's lineage. This woman has asked to bind herself to the crown by consent. That consent stands regardless of blood. The council murmured. Victor did not murmur. He watched me with a hunger that smelled like a coming storm. "You are changing precedent," he said again, and then, with a small, impossible smile, he added, "for better or worse." That night, alone in the registry, I opened my mother's locket. Inside was a lock of hair and a scrap of something that might once have been a spell, a charm written in a language I half remembered from lullabies. I touched it, and something inside me answered. A warmth spread, not like fire, but like a slow, living thing moving through veins. I tasted copper and old prayers. It frightened me because I had always trained myself to be the person who kept other people's secrets tidy. I was no longer merely the tidy keeper. My chest beat in rhythms that were not always human. When Seraphine came to the registry without announcement, her presence felt like the summer that comes without warning. She did not wear crown or council robes, only a plain coat that made her look years younger and a little weary. She sat across from me at my work table and watched the way I handled the locket as if inspecting a relic. "You surprised me tonight," she said simply, and there was no ceremony in her voice, only the truth. "You sang to the moon." "I didn't mean to," I whispered. "It came out of me like breath." "It matters," she said. "That song may be the key to changing the ledger, or it may be a trigger. We won't know until we learn." She reached across and placed her hand over mine, warm and steady. "Teach me," she said suddenly, with the command of a queen and the vulnerability of someone asking for a favor. "Teach me how your blood works. Teach me what your mother bound and why. If we bind the crown to the human line, I want to bind with full knowledge. I will not be the ruler who takes unawares." I looked at her hand, the same small, cool hand that had touched the locket in her chamber, and felt a tide rise inside me that had nothing to do with politics. "If I teach you," I said, "I will be exposed. The court will know everything." "Then perhaps exposure will not be the end," she replied. "Perhaps it will be the beginning." We began in secret, in the basement of the registry, under stacks of documents that had no audience. I taught Seraphine the songs that had once been whispered at my grandmother's knees. We spoke in cadence, and the syllables felt like keys. When I taught, she listened like someone learning to navigate a ship by starlight. The more she learned, the more she made me feel less like a ledger and more like a collaborator. But with each lesson, Victor's presence pressed harder. He sent emissaries to the registry, men and women with empty smiles and hungry eyes. He leaked rumors to the court about unnatural unions. He insinuated that the crown would be compromised by the wildness of witch blood. Small things happened. Someone unplugged the lights during a late-night lesson. A fire that shouldn't have started licked the registry's rafters, and I felt, with a cold precision, that we were being tested. One night, Victor came alone to the basement. The air smelled of wet stone. He stood in the doorway with the kind of sincere smile criminals use to charm a witness. "You sing to the moon," he said, studying me like a specimen. "It is a useful thing. You could be very valuable, Mara." "I am not for sale," I said. My voice didn't tremble, The witch blood hummed like a thread between my ribs. "No," he agreed, his smile like an inspection. "You are for choosing. Which is worse, I suppose." Seraphine stepped forward then, sudden and unadorned. She did not reach for a weapon. Instead, she stood with the unspoken weight of the crown behind her. "You will not touch her," she said simply. Victor's expression did not change. "I have no interest in harming you, Queen," he said. "I am merely making a point. Precedent is not to be toyed with." "You will find I am no longer the woman who takes without accounting," Seraphine replied. "You will find I can choose differently." The threat in his gaze acknowledged a new reality, a queen who asked, a human who named her. The basement felt like a ship's hull, creaking under the new strain of change. Victor left with a silk-imprinted bow and a promise that sounded like a threat. When he was gone, Seraphine's hand squeezed mine. "We are walking towards something," she said. "It may be beauty. It may be violence. I will not force you into anything you do not want." The honesty of that promise undid me and made me steadier. I thought then of my brother's mangled hands, of my mother's ledger, of the lullabies that had kept us until we could no longer pretend safety was a thing you inherit without cost. I thought of certainty, of a queen who could bend law and an archivist who could bind a name into history. We were moving toward a future that could be read as daring or doomed. Neither of the two invited outcomes felt certain, and yet the possibility that Seraphine and I could choose together felt like a dangerous kind of love. Neither submissive nor unearned, but forged in the only way that could survive in our world, by shared risk. When the moon swelled full again and the council's decision drew near, I felt the ledger at my throat like a heartbeat. The city slept on a forced, uneasy hush. Victor's eyes slid over the rooftops like a threat. Seraphine's crown rested heavy in her chambers. And in the registry's basement, beneath wax and ink and a million small histories, we rehearsed the names we would use for our future. We were preparing to give the court its scandal and its salvation, each of us fumbling with the terrifying, luminous truth that sometimes the thing you most fear to ask for is the very thing you most need. The council's chamber smelled of old leather and older grievances. I had stood in rooms like this to witness marriages arranged and vendettas notarized, but nothing in my years of transcribing had readied me for the moment when law becomes personal and the personal becomes a public fault line. The elders lined the dais like carved weather, faces set against change. Seraphine sat at the center, crown removed and placed beside her as if to prove she could be stripped and still stand. The seal of the Crescent Court trembled on the lectern. Victor sat 3 chairs down, his pale hands folded like a gentleman's promise. I stood between 2 worlds that wanted me on different sides of the ledger. The first revelation arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a soft, lethal unraveling. Elder Marek, a man whose pack had eaten winters for breakfast, rose and cleared his throat, with the slow patience of someone unloading a weight. His hands were steady, but his eyes glinted like a wolf. "There are precedents," he began, "and then there are anomalies. The archivist proposes a new binding. We have considered. We have heard the Queen's endorsement, but there are whispers." Whispers? Victor's smile folded the word into something sharp. Or facts. I present counsel. The archivist's line has a history of unorthodox rites. Witchblood and covenants with Lycans can invite instability. I submit evidence. Silence crashed into the chamber like a rock. Victor's dossier, beautifully bound, cruelly precise, was placed on the lectern with a care that suggested affection for the violence of documentation. He fingered a page and let the room read what he had harvested. A list of deaths, a chronicle of strange occurrences around Mara Ellis' family, a forged ledger entry lifting ancestors into criminal complicity. The ink suggested malice. The dates suggested careful research. My stomach folded into a hollow that felt like hunger. Fabrication, I said instantly, the word leaving me like a thrown gauntlet. I stepped forward, and something in Seraphine's gaze steadied me, an iron rod hidden in the soft of her eyes. Those records are altered. Someone has gone into archives and rewritten pages to change context. My mother's ledger is damaged, yes, but it is not a criminal ledger. She traded for protection that went wrong. She was afraid. Victor regarded me as if I were an interesting footnote in a book he would perhaps collect. Fear creates bargains, he observed. Bargains create obligations. Obligations sometimes require clarification. He tapped the dossier with a long fingernail. We are choosing not simply a woman, but a lineage's capacity to disrupt. Elder Marek folded his hands behind his back. Proof, he said, and his voice was hunger disguised as humility. Unless we can establish without doubt the archivist's line is not a contagion, we cannot proceed. The chamber pressed around me like an animal closing its jaws. I could feel the past in the room, my mother's scrawl, the ledger's half-burn, the lullabies, and it felt suddenly violent to be pulled from private grief into public interrogation. Seraphine rose, her movement quiet but absolute. "You ask for proof," she said to Marek, and then directly to Victor, and yet present only insinuation. "You could have come to the registry to view original documents. You chose to sensationalize." Victor inclined his head politely. "Conduct that inspection, and perhaps the court will see a pattern. Or perhaps they will see the threat. Either way, the truth is that we cannot bind without certainty." The fissure began small, a hairline crack along the chamber's foundations. It widened when the old guard voted for a temporary hold on the binding until perfectly verified documentation could be produced. Seraphine called for calm. She offered compromise. I thought she would speak for me, that she would unmake the hold with a single regal decree of trust. Instead, a different fracture widened. Lieutenant Rourke, Seraphine's second-in-command, a man who'd answered to her for 30 years and whose loyalty was as famed as his temper, stood and, for the first time I had seen, did not mirror the Queen's will. He wore his fur as armor and his betrayal like a coin he flipped. "This is prudent," Rourke said. His voice held the gravel of someone who had walked pack politics long enough to know which way the wind leaned. "The court cannot be rash." "But the process," Seraphine began, and I watched the colors drain from her face, the way a painting fades when touched by too much light. Rourke's eyes slid to me with something like pity. "A binding without due caution invites disaster. We will not permit sentimental exceptions." It was not loyalty that broke in that moment. It was deference, an acknowledgement that the Queen's personal inclinations could be overridden by the court's machinery. To the council, I had become an inconvenient variable. To Rourke, I represented Seraphine's potential folly. The room tilted. I felt my mouth open to answer and then clamped it shut, because words felt useless against a wall that had been built over centuries of precedent. Seraphine's hand on my arm was cool and urgent. "We will stand aside for now," she whispered, and the words were a blade disguised as mercy. "We will prove the ledger's authenticity. We will ensure your lineage's records are clear." But it was not a time for partial victories. Rourke's public caution became private action. That night I found a note slipped beneath my door, a warning penned in someone else's hand, suggesting the court would accept nothing less than total compliance. It said nothing about proof. It said everything about patience. The implication was a threat flavored with administrative propriety. Victor used patience as a tool of attrition. He begun to spread rumors that the witch blood in my veins could be rallied by other forces. Vampire sympathizers, rogue witches, even the ghost lines of old Fey contracts. He insinuated that my mother had been at the center of a cabal. He sent, courtesy of his wide influence, an anonymous letter to the registry's board, alleging that the ledger contained not only bargains, but a clause that, if activated, would bind the crown to the archivist's line in perpetuity, nullifying any future claims by other houses. The letter was elegant, cruel, and false. It said my mother had planned to subvert the court's authority and groom our line to supersede Lycan rule. Someone in the council blinked and, like so many who prefer the comfort of a simple story to the jaggedness of nuance, began to believe. The old prejudices are always hungry enough to eat a scandal. That night, after a meeting that had ended in a stalemate and a score of bitter faces, I came down to the registry to find a group of braves waiting in the stack rooms. Seraphine's braves, but not all of them. Among them stood Rourke, his presence like a threat hunched in a doorway. They had come with a summons, for me to be brought before a private tribunal and inspected in ways that felt more like violation than verification. "This is beyond procedure," I said. My voice felt thin as paper, but it held. Papers had always been my defense. You cannot demand forced examination. "We can, and we will," Rourke said. His voice held no malice, it held conviction, for the safety of the court. Seraphine's face hardened when she learned of the tribunal. She moved like a woman who had been clipped by betrayal, but intended to bleed only on her own terms. "You will not force her," she said to Rourke, and it was the first command that sounded less like a suggestion. Rourke did not listen. He produced a small seal, legal in its appearance, corrupt in its intent, and declared that the council's temporary hold allowed for compelled examination of any person involved in a proposed binding. It was an act of bureaucratic cruelty, and it was, as Victor would have preferred, framed as law. The tribunal convened in the stone vault beneath the palatial wing, where records of tragedies and triumphs were catalogued with equal coldness. Bravers stood at the edges like shadows. Elders read aloud charge after charge, pitch perfect in their recital of statutes. I sat in the center, the locket against my sternum like an altar. Seraphine stood behind me, but she did not interrupt the process. Perhaps she feared that to interfere would make the court question her judgment further. When they demanded I disrobe for the sake of ritual verification, I felt something ancient and embittered in me erupt. It was not shame that clawed up my throat. It was anger, the kind of pure, white-hot anger that comes from being stripped not of clothing, but of agency. "You will not touch me," I said then, and the tribunal flinched as if I had thrown a stone. "You will not treat me like an exhibit." Rourke's face was stony. Elder Marek leaned forward. Victor's hands were folded as always. "We must be certain," Marek recited. "We cannot bind based on emotion." "Emotion?" I laughed, thin, incredulous. "What is this if not emotion? You claim law, but your law is a web woven to protect power. I offered my consent. You are weaponizing your fears." The words landed like sparks. Seraphine's chair scraped back then, subtle, deliberate. "This tribunal is a sham," she said, and the room turned like a tide. "You are weaponizing process against a woman who has offered everything she can. I will not permit my court to use law as a blade." Rourke's loyalty cracked visibly at her noun choice, my name. The pronoun meant protection. "You would stand with her against the court?" he demanded, and for a terrifying blink I saw the true beast behind his civility. He was not merely a man protecting order. He was a man who loved order like a god. "I stand for her right to choose," Seraphine replied. "You stand for precedent. Which of us values the court's future?" That was the fracture. It spread faster than any argument. Lines drawn in the marble wings of the palace. Bravers took sides. Elders shifted like weather. Victor pressed his lips into a necklace of disdain and watched with the patience of someone who profits from division. Rourke left with his honor intact, but his position compromised. He would not betray Seraphine openly, but he would stand aside in ways that mattered, reassigning key braves, delaying protection convoys, feeding the rumor mills with quieter doubts. I felt the rupture like a stone dropped into a pond. The rings it made were wide and indifferent. The court had fractured not over facts, but over fear, and fear in power wears the face of law. That night, Seraphine did something I will not forget. In the glow of the registry lamps, she took my ledger and set it between us as if it were a proposition. "If the court will not accept your word," she said, voice soft and fierce, "then we will make our own proof. We will not let the machinations of men and vampires determine who you are or what your line may offer. I will stand with you in public even when the court does not. I will declare your rights, and I will bear the consequences." The raw, exposed sincerity of that declaration trembled in me like a struck bell. For a moment, brief and sacred, I believed the possibility of a different kind of covenant, one not dictated by law, but chosen, one where the Queen's arm sheltered rather than shackled. Then the ledger snapped shut between us like a verdict. "Then understand what that means," I said, the cost of her vow settling around us like smoke. "If you stand with me, you stand against people you have trusted. They will call it betrayal. They will find every lever to make you regret it." "I will count the cost," she replied. "I will name it in the margins of our history. I would rather be called a traitor to law than a queen who took what she wanted and claimed it as mercy." The fissures in the court did not close that night. They widened, frost into crack, into divorce. Allies redirected petitions, families reconsidered alliances. And Victor? He smiled. He had made his point. Doubt could be as lethal as claws. I went to bed with the ledger under my pillow and woke with the taste of old iron in my mouth. The fractures had ruptured trust in ways I had not imagined. I had asked for a crown and found instead knives. I had chosen a woman who had chosen me, and in that choice, the world tilted. The court would not willingly step into the sun with a human whose blood could change law. They preferred shadows. We were, I realized with a slow, hardening clarity, no longer merely pursuing a pact. We were attempting to create a future in which two unequal powers could consent and transform. It was an audacious hope, and, for all the reasons the elders gave, a dangerous one. The night before the final vote, a vote that would determine whether the binding would be allowed to proceed under calibrated protections or vetoed until every doubt was eradicated, Victor left a gift on the registry steps. A single page torn from the ledger, singed and smeared with a handprint that was not mine. It read, in rewritten script, a clause that made me appear to bind the crown and seize the court. I picked it up and felt the room tilt. Somewhere else, someone laughed. In the distance, the moon looked down like a judge. Between us, Seraphine's hand closed over mine. "We will answer with truth," she said, and I believed her because a queen does not make promises like that without staking everything, or because she had learned in her long life of taking the rare power of asking. I looked at her. The woman who had the power to take any woman she wanted, and thought of the ledger, of Victor's dossier, of Rourke's retreat, of the council's brittle appetites. The fracture lines they had revealed spattered the palace in a pattern I could not repair with ink. But the truth is stubborn, and so am I. "We will answer," I said, "even if it breaks us." Seraphine's fingers tightened. Outside, the moon kept its slow, indifferent watch, and the court prepared to decide whether consent could outweigh history, whether love could law. In the quiet between us, a new, dangerous hope rose like a tide, beautiful, risky, and utterly ours. The first sound of violence ripped through the council's hush like a blown horn, a cry that was almost animal and almost human, and which echoed off the carved stone until it felt as if the palace itself was being tested for cracks. I turned and saw Victor's emissary, an elegant blade bride I had only met in passing, collapse. A neat, deliberate cut at her throat that bled very quickly and very loudly. Chairs toppled, people screamed. The room split into panic and calculation at once. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds, if this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. Seraphine moved like rumor made real. Her hand was at my throat before I could form the thought that I might be next. The court's guards surged. Victor's pale smile spread like a disease. I had never seen the queen move with the kind of speed that erased distance. Only the slow, stately authority that bent rooms to her will. In the same breath, she was both my sovereign and the only person who could stand between me and the blade. She shoved me behind her, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the heat of her back and the cold of blood. Someone called out for order. Someone else tried to usher the dying woman to safety. And in that chaos, I saw Victor step forward, and the whole of the chamber fell open like a wound. "Enough," Seraphine said, and the syllable was not an argument but an edict. She did not draw blade. She did not invoke pack law. Instead, she stripped the crown from the table and crushed it in her palm. A symbolic war a queen does not often wage publicly. The sapphires shattered, slivers that flashed like eyes across the marble. The court gasped. The elders recoiled. Victor's smile faltered for the first time. "You will not use fear as policy in my houses," Seraphine declared. Her voice broke, and there was a rawness in it that no one had heard from her before. "If you would frighten me into submission, you have misread the century that made me." Victor laughed then, a thin sound. "You sacrifice trinkets and gestures, Seraphine. You cannot bargain with facts. Someone wishes to discredit this binding, and violence is the instrument of persuasion. Do not play the martyr." "Perhaps I will," she said, and there was a fierceness to her that felt like winter light. "If martyrdom means I protect a woman whose consent I would honor, then do not call it foolish. Call it exactly what it is." And then she did something that stopped my breath. She bared her arm, not ceremonially, but in a way that felt intimate and offered. Where the council expected procedure, she offered vulnerability. Her skin glowed faintly in the torchlight, and as she turned her wrist toward me, I saw the old Lycan brand, lines of heritage and law that marked those of the Crescent Court by blood and decree. She had, in that small motion, made it possible for me to bind her in a way the court could not immediately unravel. "Blood binding in open court," Victor sneered. "A stunt." "It is legal," Seraphine said, "and it is necessary." My hands trembled as I reached for her. The ledger beneath my palm felt like an accusation and a map at once. A chorus of objections rose: protocol, precedence, danger. But Seraphine put a finger to her lips, and the murmur stilled as if someone had smothered them. The moment was foolish and brave, and everything that had led us here, my mother's scrawled warning and my own reckless truth, compressed into a single decision. I would bind with her not because law demanded it, but because she had offered herself openly, and because to refuse would be betrayal of a different kind. We prepared there in the wreckage of the council, a shallow bowl of silver, the locket at my throat, the crown shards at Seraphine's feet. The elder who had once demanded proof presided with a face that read like weather. Victor watched with a predator's interest and the sort of patience that meant he'd calculated for the worst. My blood sang in my veins like a secret tuned to the moon. I lifted the silver bowl and waited as Seraphine offered her wrist. "When you asked me to teach you," she whispered, "not to the room, but to me, I did not imagine I would need to teach a court what consent looked like. But I promised you truth. Take it. We exchanged blood as the rites prescribed, each of us an offering. And the moment our lips brushed the rim of the bowl together, I felt the world tilt." Seraphine closed her eyes. Her jaw opened slightly, a human instant of surrender I had never been allowed to witness. I dipped a sharp silver pin into the wine-dark pool and made the smallest incision on my palm. Her gleaming teeth showed the kind of fear she did not display in law. When her blood touched mine, it was like hearing a cathedral and a storm, old, honest, and furious. For a heartbeat, nothing else existed but the intimacy of red and the heat of the moon pressing against stone. Then Victor lunged. He had expected chaos, the sort that leaves the strong standing and the vulnerable broken. He expected to make the court flinch at the scandal and then pounce, offering himself as a stabilizer afterward. Instead, he miscalculated the greatest weapon there was: two people choosing one another where both had everything to lose. Victor's hand brushed Seraphine's shoulder as he moved through the crowd, a touch meant to be a threat. In reflex, some old oath awakened. Seraphine's eyes opened, and in them was not the calculated ruler, but the feral, raw, ancestral wolf. She moved like a colliding tide, graceful, terrible, and braced in front of me. Victor's intent faltered when his fingers met her flesh and blood, and he stumbled back with a curse that smelled like iron and old arrogance. The wound came then, sudden and bright. A blade meant for me nicked her side, carving flesh in a way that sent a hot, searing fury through the room. Blood speckled the marble. The court went silent, as if sound had broken its vows. Seraphine sagged, but did not fall. She leaned on me instead, choosing my shoulder as her brace. Her breath came shallow and quick. "Stay with me," she said, and there was no command in it, only a plea I had never expected to receive. I had always believed sacrifices were meant to be the cost of power. I had expected to surrender privacy for protection, autonomy for an heir. I had not expected her to bear the blade in my stead. The pain that roared up in me was not solely for the wound, but for the vulnerability she had offered the court and for the cruelty it had repaid with a cut. Victor took his leave then, slipping into the shadows with a bow that promised retaliation. The elders closed ranks, officious hands arranging statements. Someone fetched herbs and linens with that frightened pragmatism of those who wish to heal what they had a hand in hurting. Seraphine's attendants rushed to her side, but she waved them away with a stubborn lift of chin. She wanted no balm that disguised the truth of what had happened. I pressed my palm to her side where the blood pooled warm and coppery. The locket at my throat flared, and the witch song in my mouth rose, Less ritual now and more prayer. It was an old chant my mother used to hum when storms came to the windows. I sang it, and, absurdly, it worked. The wound cooled beneath my touch, as if the air itself had learned a new vocabulary for healing. The elder who presided, skeptical and hard as he was, watched with something like awe as the flesh knit with a patience that was not quite human. When the bruises closed and the blood stilled, Seraphine turned to the council and, voice steady though it trembled, said, "You have seen proof tonight. For better or worse, I choose this woman by my will, and I will answer for that choice. Any who would weaponize law against consent will find themselves on the wrong side of history." Her sacrifice had not been only the wound. It was the public admission that she would lose something intangible and vast, trust among those who had once obeyed her without question. She had exposed herself to judgment to protect a woman she had chosen, and in doing so, she had changed the currency of the court. The room did not immediately convert to believers. Some glared, others, thoughtful and secretive, counted their losses. Victor's eyes burned with a promise to fracture us more brilliantly in time. But in the silence that followed the action, something in the council shifted, small, like the first crack of a thaw. Elder Marek lowered his head slightly, an almost unnoticed bow. The crowd softened a fraction. Rourke, whom I had watched for betrayal, left the chamber with a face so conflicted I feared it might break him. Seraphine sat and took my hand, holding it like a votive. "You asked me to be taught," she said, and the corners of her mouth quirked into something like a tired smile, and I learned that some things are worth a wound. I rested my forehead against hers, tasting iron on both our lips, and for a breath, one trembling, improbable breath, the world felt less like a ledger and more like a living thing we were both learning to write in. The vote would still come. Victor still waited in the dark with patience honed into malice. But she had bled for me, chosen me under law and wound, and I had, in that small, scared, fierce moment, become something else. Not an entry in a ledger, but a person whom a queen would defend. We had not won. We had not even guaranteed safety. We had, instead, claimed each other in a way the court could not easily undo. And in a world where bargains were the architecture of life, that claim, messy, bloody, and utterly consensual, felt like the most dangerous, most beautiful kind of rebellion. The aftermath smelled like lavender and iron. The council dispersed in staggered groups, some to mend reputations, others to whisper of safer bets. But the registry hummed with a new electricity. We moved through it together in the small hours. Seraphine leaned on me where the wound had been, not because she needed me to cradle her, but because she wanted to, with her whole body, to test the truth of the choice she had made. I could feel the brand of her lineage through the fabric of her coat, and under my palm, her pulse beat a stubborn, living answer. The court's fracture did not mend overnight. There were petitions, late-night meetings where threats were transposed into polite demands, and quiet dinners where alliances were recalculated by candlelight. Victor's shadow did not recede. If anything, he sharpened, an ache that taught me how fragile our victory was. Yet with every rumor he sent out, Seraphine met it with a fact or a scar. With every whisper meant to shame me, she offered a reminder that I had asked and she had agreed. Her defense was not always rhetoric. Sometimes it was a simple, tangible thing. She sat with me at the registry's table and helped me catalog my mother's ledger, not as a sovereign inspecting a curiosity, but as a woman reading the messy, human script of another woman who had loved wildly and feared worse. We learned how to live under scrutiny, like two people learning to dance on thin ice. There were days when the weight of history felt like a suit of armor too heavy to bear. In those moments, we retreated to the registry's basement when no one came and where our voices could be private. We talked about practical things, laws to amend, witnesses to summon, protections for my brother and for neighbors who were suddenly vulnerable by association. We also talked about stupid, ordinary things, which linens we preferred, how Seraphine still hated rain on silk, the way I made coffee too strong. Those small intimacies felt like stitches across an open place. My brother began to sleep through the night again. The ledger's burned edge stopped looking like a threat and more like a map. The lullabies my grandmother taught us resurfaced, leaned on by Seraphine until the words learned to mean hope rather than warning. The court's vote finally came, not as a thunderous pronouncement, but as a reluctant, technical acceptance. Provisions written to ensure oversight, clauses to accommodate witchblood, and a binding that named consent as its cornerstone. It was not perfect. It was, however, a new kind of law. On the night the sanction was signed, the moon hung like a clean coin. We walked back to the registry together, hands clasped in a way that had once been unthinkable. The streets were mostly silent. Even the city seemed to hold its breath as if to honor a fragile human triumph. At the registry's doorstep, we stopped. Seraphine turned and, almost shyly, touched the locket at my throat. "You taught me to ask," she said, voice low, "and you taught me to wait for an answer that mattered." I kissed the scar by her side, still faint, a pale seam, and it tasted of iron and of vows. Behind us, the palace held its old, complicated music. Ahead, the ledger waited, a story still being written. The moon watched us as it always had, indifferent and infinite. This time, though, its light fell on two people who had chosen each other in full view of history. It pooled around us like a promise that was neither law nor possession, but something we would keep tending together.